Well, good morning. Because I'm so old, I have one of my students helping me with the PowerPoint. Yes, so I started working on this biography of Warren Lewis in 2015, and I've spent many hours at the Wade Center being taken care of by David and Crystal and the rest of the staff. Always a warm time when I'm there. I want to preface my talk this morning with what I found to be a thorny dilemma the moment I decided to write this biography. That is, how to refer to the names of the two brothers. I knew that constant references to C.S. Lewis or C.S.L. or the even more unforgivable Clive would become both tiresome and irritating. The solution I adopted was convenient, appropriate, and efficient, but not without risk. Because C.S. Lewis's family name was Jack, and that was also the one that Warren would have used, and because Warren's family name was Warney, I decided to risk the ire of some of my fellow Lewis scholars who might believe my use of Jack and Warney suggested an intimacy with the two men that I couldn't have shared. So I beg your indulgence this morning, and I hope you'll become at ease with my use of Jack and Warney. Although Warney is best known as the beloved brother of Jack, a biography of his life is certainly necessary because of his intimate involvement in the military, social, and cultural history of 20th century England. Warney fought in World War I as a young, untried officer. His experience in history's greatest bloodbath mirrored that of thousands of others. In addition, his nightmarish days in northern France call to mind the war poetry of Edmund Blundell, Ivor Gurney, David Jones, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Edward Thomas, as well as the prose of Sassoon and Robert Graves and their German counterparts, including Ernest Junger. Moreover, as a career Army officer later serving in Sierra Leone and Shanghai, Warney's Eurocentric sensibilities made him incapable of seeing the ways in which British colonialism shaped and hampered his understanding of native African and Chinese people. Retiring from the Army at the relatively young age of 37, Warney spent the remainder of his life resolved to what he called enjoy the business of living, by which he meant finding satisfaction and meaning in a life outside the world of billets and barracks. In addition to what's been noted, several additional matters underscore the importance of writing this biography. First, Warney's life sheds new light on his famous brother, including the warm and loving relationship between the two brothers that lasted throughout their lives. As young boys, Jack and Warney bonded quickly, in part a response to the loss at early ages of their mother, Flora, and their corresponding complicity against what they believed was the emotional, intellectual, and social intrusions upon their lives by their father, Albert. Jack's autobiography, Surprised by Joy, as well as the first volume of his collected letters, provide ample evidence of this complicity. However, we haven't really explored in any depth Warney's response to his mother's death and his father's role in his early life. In addition, Warney struggled with alcoholism, and that's well known, but its origin, its influence on his life, and its impact on Jack's life has not really been explored in any detail up until now. Moreover, after the death of Jack, Warney lived another 10 years that became increasingly dark as he grieved the passing of his beloved brother. Secondly, this biography explores Warney as an accomplished writer and amateur historian. That is, he was not university trained, and nevertheless, he researched and wrote 7 books on 17th century French history. In addition, Warney collected, edited, and wrote the 11-volume typescript manuscript Memoirs of the Lewis Family, 1850 to 1930. Further, he wrote 8 essays on his experience piloting a motorboat on and around the canals in Oxford. Moreover, after Jack's death in 1963, Warney published the letters of C.S. Lewis. These volumes continue to be consulted by researchers today wanting to learn more about the life of C.S. Lewis. But perhaps Warney's greatest written work was his diary. He kept one for roughly 50 years, and it runs to 1.2 million words. Yet little scholarly work has been done on the nature of any of these writings. Warney's strengths and weaknesses as a researcher and a writer, and how these works contribute to our understanding of him and his famous brother, are really important. Third, this account of Warney's life examines his role as an original member, along with his brother and J.R.R. Tolkien, of the Oxford Inklings, that now famous group of novelists, thinkers, churchmen, poets, essayists, medical men, scholars, and friends who met regularly to drink beer and to hear written compositions read aloud and to discuss books, ideas, history, and writers. In his diaries, Warney often wrote summaries of what occurred at the various gatherings of the Inklings. Here are some of the things he discusses: the possibility of dogs having souls, the morality of the Nuremberg trials, the possibility of communications with the dead, the moral aspects of atomic bombing and total war, second sight, or the ability to perceive future or distant events, the ethics of cannibalism. Are there any ethics of cannibalism? You can imagine the Inklings talking about these kinds of things. The almost impossible challenge of interesting the uneducated indifferent in religion. How far pagan mythology was a substitute for theology. The various versions of the Bible. A.E. Houseman and his ferocious prefaces. Public schools. Sherlock Holmes stories. The inexplicable problem of why some children are allowed to die in infancy, and whether poets created or reflected the mood of their time. Warney's wit was often on display during a meeting of the Inklings. On one occasion, when the audience had flatly refused to hear Jack discourse on and define chance, Jack said, "Very well, some other time, but if you die tonight, you'll be cut off knowing a great deal less about chance than you might have." Warney said, "That only illustrates what I've always said, every cloud has a silver lining." Fourth, this biography delves into Warney's participation as an active member of the household of the Kilns, the residence in Headington that he co-owned with his brother and Mrs. Janie Moore. In fact, after his retirement from the Army in the early 1930s, 2 rooms were added to the Kilns that served as his study and bedroom for the rest of his life. This biography draws extensively from Warney's published and unpublished diaries and yields new insights about life at the Kilns, especially the relationship between Jack and Mrs. Moore, between Warney and Jack, between Warney and Mrs. Moore, and between the various other members of the household. Of special interest to many will be the unhappy nature of Warney's relationship with Mrs. Moore. By the time of her death in the early 1950s, Warney disliked her deeply. More on this in a moment. Lastly, this life of Warney reveals the important role he played in the relationship between Jack and the woman that he married, Joy Davidman. As his brother's secretary, Warney read Joy's initial correspondence with his brother. A confirmed bachelor, Warney might have resisted Joy's overt efforts to develop a friendship with his brother, perhaps seeing her as a gold digger. Yet this was not the case. And despite his awareness that Joy wanted more than just friendship with his brother, Warney was not jealous or protective. In fact, he came to love Joy deeply, noting the divine irony that just as Mrs. Moore was gradually removed from his brother's everyday care, Joy was slowly becoming an important part of that life. He admired her courage as she fought the cancer that eventually took her life, and he grieved deeply when she died. As much as Warney had come to despise Mrs. Moore, it's important to know how much he loved Joy as a confidant, counselor, collaborator, sister, editor, and beloved friend. After his own mother, Flora, I believe Joy was the woman that Warney loved most in his life. In subsequent letters to friends, he commented on the loss. To one, he confessed that Joy's death had left a hole in him that no one else could fill. Although Warney knew his loss was nothing compared to Jack's, he still affirmed that he missed Joy dreadfully. He especially admired her fun-filled life despite her pain and suffering. Now, a couple of caveats. In writing this biography, I tried as much as possible to resist writing yet another biography of Jack. Many good ones exist, including especially my friend Hal Poe's 3-volume exploration of Jack's life. At the same time, because the lives of the two brothers were so intertwined, it's inevitable that at certain points I may have strayed perilously close to sketching too much of the life of Jack, and I hope readers will forgive me for those lapses. Third, Warney's diary, as I've already suggested, is the primary source for this biography. And I want to talk here just a minute about diary keeping. An important value of keeping a diary is that it affords the diarist the forum for honest candor. On one hand, the diarist can unashamedly confess doubt, fear, joy, prejudice, delight, lust, empathy, anger, satisfaction, envy, and so on. On the other hand, the diarist can explore the surprising truths that rise to the surface by writing that is free, open, and unchecked. This means that the diary writer can see what he or she thinks, not just think it. Thoughts are fleeting, ephemeral, and wispy things, and often jumbled, garbled, and incoherent. Perhaps I'm only talking about my mental life. One may think he or she holds certain beliefs housed in a personal mental strongbox. However, it's only when the thoughts are written down to see that one can begin to consider the following. Do I really believe that? Does that actually represent me at my deepest core? Does this cause me to live my everyday life the way I do? Or has seeing written down on paper what I say I believe actually exposed my beliefs as absurd, unsupportable, ill-informed, and hypocritical? Sometimes a diarist may shock himself or herself when the answer to these questions is the opposite of what he or she had always assumed. Thus, the chief value of keeping a diary is that the written word trumps fuzzy, nonlinear, imprecise thinking. Words on paper are clear, objective, solid, so the diarist can explore with no restraint every facet of his or her belief system. Furthermore, a diarist is self-absorbed. It follows that we should not be overly critical of a diarist for his or her self-focus. Every self, in the end, is self-focused. At least the diarist admits as much. In Warney's case, he read diaries constantly and often reflected upon the diarists. As we read his diary, we learn Warney's unfiltered opinions, convictions, and prejudices. Indeed, the insight we gain into Warney's psychology is the central reason I think we read him. His was a life of existential loneliness. The early death of his mother, the emotional estrangement from his father, the lack of a long-term romantic relationship, his deep psychological reliance upon his brother, and the absence of many deep and sustained male friends and his dependence on alcohol are all markers of this loneliness. Accordingly, in this biography, I've drawn extensively from his diaries and explore those issues among others. It would be a mistake to assume that Warney's life can primarily be understood as the only sibling of Jack. Undoubtedly, the relationship between the two brothers plays a central role in both their lives, and I don't neglect the importance of this relationship. However, Warney was also, as I've suggested, a soldier, an Inkling, and a noted French historian of the 17th century. These three lives are given particular attention in the biography. Now, 4 final takeaways with regard to this biography. There are a number of contrasts between Jack and Warney, and I'll just touch on a few here this morning. In the opening pages of C.S. Lewis's autobiography, Surprised by Joy, The Shape of My Early Life, he relates a story that explains the genesis of what he calls Sehnsucht, or joy. He writes, "Once in those very early days, my brother brought into the nursery the lid of a biscuit tin, which he had covered with moss and garnished with twigs and flowers so as to make it a toy garden or a toy forest. That was the first beauty I ever knew. As long as I live, my imagination of paradise will retain something of my brother's toy garden." While the impact of this story has long been recognized as marking the central theme of Jack's life and works, joy, what has not been noticed until now is how significant this incident is to the life and works of Warney. That is, in the making of that toy garden, we see the defining mark of Warney's life, an approach that was tactile, practical, and utilitarian. While for Jack, the toy garden awakened a powerful, nurturing, aesthetic sense, for Warney, the episode illustrates that he was given to working with things, with objects in the world before him, with the matters of everyday life. He fabricated the toy garden for his brother with no idea how it would impact his imagination. Rather, Warney put together the toy garden because he delighted in making, constructing, and assembling. Indeed, throughout his life, Warney took a pragmatic and hands-on view of life. He was concerned with how things work, the continuous flow of life, the day-to-day, and the present and pressing matters of the moment captured his attention. This vision of life explains his penchant for history, thus the books he wrote, his interest in current events, his keen awareness of what was happening in contemporary English society, and his primary focus on the matters of everyday experience. Warney was a careful reporter, a sharp-eyed observer, and an active doer. His mind was prosaic rather than poetic, pragmatic rather than imaginative, and engaged rather than detached. If Jack was romantic, reflective, and intuitive, Warney was realistic, practical, and commonsensical. In short, if Jack was right-brained, Warney was left-brained. A couple of other distinctions between Warney and Jack. Both were voracious readers, however, the ends for which they read were different. In general, when Warney read, he was essentially exercising what might be called an applied imagination, meaning that he enjoyed reading and writing towards serviceable ends. His later works on the Lewis Papers, his own diary, his essays about boating, and his books on French history are expressions of this applied imagination. Moreover, although he was a devoted reader throughout his life, for him, reading was primarily for pleasure and information. Witness his later dogged reading of Shakespeare's plays, even when he was not particularly enjoying the play at hand. And I could say more about that, but I won't now. Reading was a great enjoyment for him, but primarily it was a way for him to expend time and to move life along, not as a particular source of inspiration, imaginative interaction, or literary development. When Jack read, on the other hand, he was exercising a creative imagination. He enjoyed reading and writing toward intuitive, reflective, and aesthetic ends. Certainly his deep reading of the towering figures of Western literature, including Homer, Virgil, and Dante, and of English literature in particular, especially Chaucer, Spenser, Shakespeare, Milton, George Herbert, Samuel Johnson, Jane Austen, William Wordsworth, George MacDonald, William Morris, and G.K. Chesterton served as the wellhead of Jack's creative imagination. He read and wrote in order to explore, express, and nourish his already rich imagination. Excuse me. A second significant difference concerned their spiritual lives. Jack and Warney were both melancholics. However, they were different kinds of melancholics. Jack was a sanguine melancholic. I know that sounds like an oxymoron. Jack was a sanguine melancholic. The world might be a mess and its people even messier. And yes, human existence was problematic. Suffering argued against a world with purpose, and the early death of his mother left a deep wound. Still, when he viewed all this through the lens of his Christian faith, Jack did not take the darker view. He was buoyed by his confidence in the goodness of God's character, even when he did not understand the mystery of pain, suffering, and doubt. Warney, on the other hand, was a phlegmatic melancholic. When he looked at the world, it was an existential puzzle. Although he shared his brother's Christian faith, he did not take comfort in it in the same way. Too much of his own life had been touched by deep disappointment. As I've mentioned, the loss of his mother, the horrors of World War I, the crushing boredom of his years in the army, and his unwelcomed return to military service, in particular during War II, as well as his conflicted life at the Kilns with Mrs. Moore. As Warney mused on his existence, a dark shadow loomed over him and pervaded his day-to-day reality. If Jack found in Christianity an answer to his melancholy, Warney found only a partial answer, one that as years went by, he supplemented with an increasing use of alcohol. Regrettably, Warney's internal gaze and phlegmatic melancholy fed off each other, causing his alcoholic consumption to accelerate. So, at the risk of a simplistic summary, I'd put their spiritual difference this way. Jack knew God while Warney knew about God. Jack opened himself up to a full gaze of God. Warney was only able to glimpse God. Jack dove in and risked all. Warney only waded in, hedging his bets. In the fullness of God's gaze, Jack found freedom. Warney instead found discomfort. Although it sounds as if I'm finding fault with Warney's Christian faith, it is probably the case that most Christians, including me, are more like Warney than Jack. Given how far I've pushed things, I offer an additional hyperbolic flourish. Jack is George Herbert to Warney's Dr. Samuel Johnson. Jack is William Wordsworth to Warney's Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Jack is George MacDonald to Warney's W.T. Kirkpatrick. Jack is Lucy Penfancy to Warney's Trumpkin the Dwarf. Jack is Jewel the Unicorn to Warney's Bree the Warhorse. Jack is Reepicheep to Warney's Truffle Hunter the Badger. Jack is Psyche to Warney's Orual. Some of the most important aspects of Warney's life become wonderfully imagined through detailed memoirs or character sketches that appear in the Lewis papers. Let me check my time here. For instance, Warney's recollection of his experience at Wynyard, the horrific school that Jack calls Belson in his autobiography, center primarily around the headmaster, Robert Capron. They called him Oldie. Perhaps the most lasting impression Warney has of Capron are found in his physical descriptions and his teaching methods. Capron's face, writes Warney, was marred by the nose, which was small and had the appearance of being varnished, and from which the lobe of the right nostril had at some time been removed. Of medium height, well-built and physically powerful, Capron inspired fear. Warney recalls that the headmaster could lift a boy of 12 years old off the floor by a collar, hold him at arm's length like one might a dog, and then, quote, refresh the unfortunate youth's memory by applying his cane to his calves. Also memorable was Capron's neglect of personal hygiene, with Warney remembering his dirty beard, dandruff-powdered collar, tobacco-stained fingers and mustache, and wolfish eating habits. His commanding voice struck fear in all the students and suffered no opposition. Without Warney's carefully realized accounts of Capron, readers today would little understand the nightmarish experience of Warney and Jack at Wynyard. This sketch of Capron was certainly discussed with Jack, and in his later autobiography, Surprised by Joy, it's clear that Jack bases some of his own description of Capron on Warney's profiles of him in the Lewis papers. So undoubtedly, Warney was Jack's unnamed co-conspirator on parts of Surprised by Joy. Here's another sketch, one of his commanders during World War I. He was short and sturdily built, with a square head covered with gray hair, very closely cropped except in the front, where one lock usually hung down over his forehead. His ruddy, weather-beaten face contained a blunt nose, a close-clipped mustache, and a pair of very small gray eyes partially concealed by lids which were always half closed. He spoke in a low, querulous monotone. One speedily realized that the man was a mass of hate. Hatred of almost everyone was to him the normal condition of existence. A banked-up, smoldering hatred, always active, never flaring into temper, reasonless, and as intractable as the force of nature. If for any reason or no reason he took a dislike to a man, he was extraordinarily ingenious and painstaking at making his life a hell to him by 1,000 carefully thought out vexations and inflictions. He was, in fact, the worst of all types, the nagging bully. He gloated on stories of British atrocities committed on Germans. He frequently lectured his men on Germany and the Germans in the style of an Old Testament prophet. In the course of a somewhat picaresque life, Warney says, I have met a good many men of all classes and types. It raises my faith in human nature when I reflect that of all I have met, I can only recollect 4 whom I would describe as bad men. Ronald McClear is one of those. Warney's character sketches, whether brief or extended, are key components strengthening the overall quality of the Lewis papers. In these character sketches, he shows a sharp eye for physical description, but perhaps even more telling are his astute evaluations of the essential moral, spiritual, and social qualities of the individual under review. Warney's predilection for writing memoirs and character sketches serves him well throughout and equips him to write effectively and convincingly about many of the persons he later covers in his book on 17th century French history. Another takeaway. In the mid-1930s, Warney turned his attention to a project that fulfilled both a long-held dream and an immediate need. The latter was the creation of a retreat away from the Kilns. The former was the building of a boat where he could indulge his lifelong love of ships and being on the water. Both the dream and the need were met when, in 1936, he contracted with the Salter Brothers Company in Oxford, by the way, that company still exists, to build a motorboat so they could enjoy sailing on the many canals and rivers near Oxford. Drawing from the days when he and Jack created their imaginary worlds in the attic room back in Belfast, Warney named his vessel after one of the Boxen ships, the Bosphorus. Designed only for inland sailing, the Bosphorus was built to Warney's specific specifications. 20 feet long with a beam of 6 feet 8 inches and a draft, that would be the depth of water you'd need to keep the boat afloat, of 1 foot 10 inches. The interior of the Bosphorus was simple with a toilet in the bow, a 2-berth cabin 6 feet 6 inches long, a galley and a pantry, and an open cockpit with a locker in the stern. Bosphorus was powered by an 8-horsepower marine engine. Commissioned on July the 3rd, 1936, the Bosphorus went into immediate service and cost 200 pounds. Not only did Warney love touring about in the Bosphorus, but he also delighted in writing about his experiences eventually penning 8 essays published in the Motorboat and Yachting magazine from November of 1938 to June of 1939. This was a real revelation to me, finding these essays. For instance, in the first essay, But What's It Going to Cost?, Warney offers a good deal of practical advice for anyone contemplating the purchase of a river cruiser, also called a ditch crawler. He advises potential buyers to consider all the risks, especially the costs of upkeep. One source he says no one should trust is the owner who gives only vague and unsubstantiated reports about the actual financial costs of maintaining a canal boat. He writes, "I regret to say that owners of their beloved boats are no more to be trusted than mothers talking of their children. Speed is usually a little lower and fuel consumption a little higher than the proud owner is ready to admit." Although his essays are long on practical advice, he also offers thoughtful musings and reflections. For instance, he says the main benefit of spending so much time on his boat is the immediate satisfaction he receives. He writes, "But most of all are the important imponderable assets, the ever-changing panorama of the river or canal, the wind and the sun, even the rain, the village inn at the journey's end, still starlit nights, the birds at dawn, silent waters far from traffic routes and road houses, one's own little floating home. Who can calculate the value of these in pounds, shillings, and pences?" Warney also describes lovely vistas, in one essay writing, "Now I was in the heart of the real country. Cows gazed at my passing with stolid disinterest, whilst horses, on the contrary, cantered the width of the field to snort their disapproval. Heavy-coated sheep drowsed by the waterside, and among them ran panic-stricken lambs who had lost their mothers. A troop of ducks marching in a single file along the towpath quacked a greeting, and here and there a heron flapped up out of a low green meadow." The Bosphorus was Warney's promised land. Shangri-La, Arcadia, or Elysium. Throughout his army days, he sometimes grimly soldiered on, looking forward eagerly to the day when he would be free to do what he wanted to do. The move to the Kilns was the first step. His completion of the Lewis papers, the second step. Having the Bosphorus was a further move in the direction of enjoying what he called the business of life. Self-fulfillment and self-satisfaction were increasingly significant for Warney. Having a boat that he could enjoy alone or with an invited guest was a dream come true. And now I'll sort of bring this to the end by focusing on partially his relationship with Mrs. Moore. By the way, she was named, her nickname was Minto in the family because she liked that candy called Mentos. I think we still have Mentos. Usually people come up afterwards and give me a pack of Mentos when I say that. But Warney's antipathy for Minto, his brother's longtime companion and adopted mother, is well documented. Warney best sums up his jaundiced attitude towards her in his diary following her death on January the 12th, 1951. So here's what he says. "And so ends the mysterious self-imposed slavery in which Jack has lived for at least 30 years. How it began, I suppose I shall never know. It's quite idle, but nonetheless fascinating to muse of what his life might have been like if he had never had the crushing misfortune to meet her. Most infuriating to the onlooker was the fact that Minto never gave the faintest hint of gratitude. Indeed, she regarded herself as Jack's benefactor, presumably on the grounds that she had rescued him from the twin evils of bachelordom and matrimony at one swoop. Even after 10 or more years of living with her, Warney says, the Kilns still seemed to me to be a billet which I had marched into late at night and would be leaving early the following morning. Apart from the major disaster of the rape of Jack's life, what do you really think, Warney? The next worst result of his complete submission to her whims was the steady deterioration which it worked in her own character. It had never been an attractive one, and latterly it became frankly intolerable. An intense selfishness and egoism which excluded any pretense of interest in any subject but herself, and an arrogant and ignorant dogmatism on every topic, however abstruse, made her company intolerably tedious. Now, I think Warney's reference to Moore's years with his brother as the rape of Jack's life is certainly hyperbolic and ungracious. At the same time, there's little question that Moore was not an easy person to live with. Not only was Warney jealous of how Moore dominated Jack's life, but as you can tell, he found her personality maddening. And in many of his diary entries, he complains about these kinds of things: selfishness, egoism, inflexibility, stubbornness, know-it-all attitude, bossiness, baseless opinions, boring conversation, ignorance, overreaction to the unexpected, unreasonable worries, prejudices, dogmatic positions, condescension, bitter hatreds, petty meanness, and domineering personality. At one point, he wrote, "Life to her is a very simple business. On any conceivable subject, from the washing of a plate to the nature or the existence of the Trinity, there are only two opinions: the right one, held by her, and the wrong one, that held by everyone who didn't agree with her. She is quite incapable of thought, at least as I understand it, and supplies in its place with a bundle of prejudices whose origin, when it can be traced at all, proves to be a point of personal selfishness. Her selfishness is her most prominent characteristic. It fills me with both admiration and irritation to see how completely the whole of Jack's life is subordinated to hers, financially, socially, recreationally. The pity of it is that on his selflessness, her selfishness fattens." So irritated was Warney that he began to keep a log of her outlandish statements. Here's a very brief sample. Warney's just been to see the 1933 film King Kong. Maybe some of you have seen that old film. So he comes home and he says to Mrs. Moore, "The fight between the prehistoric animals was amazingly well done." Mrs. Moore says, "Were they real prehistoric animals?" In another conversation that he hears, Mrs. Moore says to a friend, "She was one of that horrible sort of person that brings her religion into her everyday, ordinary life." And then Mrs. Moore, recounting the horrors of a night spent on board a cross-channel steamer that was at dock. Mrs. Moore says, "All the lights were turned out, and there we were, about 50 of us, and the only light as from an old stable lantern on the passage floor. It was wicked. People might have been ill or anything and unable to see. I took the lantern and put it in my cabin." Then one day, Mrs. Moore is studying the map of Africa. She asks, "But where is Greece?" And then finally, Warren says about a person who's staying there at the Kilns, "Margaret will want to go to church on Easter Day. Do we know where the Presbyterian church is?" Mrs. Moore says, "No, she won't. Presbyterians don't believe in Easter." So this morning, I'm only touching on Warney's conflicted relationship with Mrs. Moore. So let me finish with a few reflections about this relationship. First, although Warney says it was a crushing misfortune that his brother ever met Mrs. Moore, I think it was also the case for Warney that it was a crushing misfortune that he met her, since most of his life after World War I was blighted by his years of living with her at the Kilns. Within only a few years of moving to the Kilns, Warney was profoundly unhappy. His relationship with Moore poisoned his life, making living at the Kilns like being in an unwelcomed army billet. While it would be unfair to blame Moore for Warney's slide into alcoholism, it has to be said that his feeling towards her certainly led him to drink excessively at times as a way of coping with being around her. Second, at the center of the conflict between Warney and Moore was Jack. Both wanted the lion's share of his attention, and so they were jealous of each other. More replaced her son Patty, who was killed during World War I, with Jack. She became possessive and obsessive about him, and she fought against anything or anyone that threatened that relationship. Warney longed to return to the idyllic days when he and Jack were in their little attic room in Belfast. He resented Moore's hold over Jack, finding it mysterious, bizarre, and frankly pathological. If two people ever fought over the soul of a third, it was Mrs. Moore and Warren Lewis. Finally, both Moore and Warney were emotionally dependent persons. Both needed someone to serve as a beacon, to be the focus of their lives that sought to find meaning and purpose in what was oftentimes an existence marked by uncertainty, confusion, and heartache. Warney and Moore would have never known each other, much less lived together for over 20 years, had not both loved Jack so much. Warney was never so happy as when he was with Jack. And he was never so happy with Jack when they went on their 8 walking tours, which I haven't had time to talk about this morning. And he was never so happy with Jack on their walking tours as when, at the end of a long day of tramping through forests, meadows, hills, often in rain or snow, they found their way to a snug little inn and took their baths, consumed a hearty meal, a pint of beer, and settled in for a quiet evening of reading. If Warney could have had his way, this would have been the life he would have chosen permanently, alone with Jack and with no distractions from Moore. It would have been as close to a return of their idyllic childhood days in the little attic room at their home in Belfast as possible. And I'll finish with just a few more comments. John Wayne, not our John Wayne the cowboy, but the English John Wayne, W-A-I-N, John Wayne, himself an Inkling, had great affection for Warney, noting among many other qualities his penchant for excellent writing. In writing about the published portions of Warney's entire diary, Wayne linked the two brothers. He writes, "I think C.S. Lewis is the best writer of expository prose that modern England has to show. He sets out his subject matter absolutely correctly, and his style is perfect from one sentence to the next. It's always rhythmical, cogent, economical, memorable. The words are right and the rhythms are right. The words are in the right order. The images are right. There is no clumsy sentence anywhere. It's absolutely superb prose." And then Wayne says, W.H. Lewis is exactly the same. In his less ambitious way, there is no clumsily written sentence anywhere in his work. He had the same gift. So, if there were ever two brothers devoted to one another, it was Jack and Warney. That they share a grave on the grounds of Holy Trinity Church, Headington Quarry, is a fitting demonstration of this devotion. They are linked even in death. Perhaps it's best to conclude with a quote from King Lear that followed Warney throughout his life, including appearing on their shared gravestone. And here's the quote, "Men must endure their going hence." Thank you.